So I'm going to pose an objection to this argument now. If we go to the next slide, I have a counterexample to premise 3. Premise 3 is worrisome because, for example, old. One day I'll eventually be old. There's no specific point where I start counting as old, but clearly I've not always been old. There's a number of vague properties with boundaries which aren't clear cut. Being old, being rich, right? Someone who has $3 billion is rich, although there's no specific point where they became rich. If I gained, it's not like there was a $1 difference or a $10 difference or a $1,000 difference. Say that I got my $3 billion by getting $1,000 a day. So each day I got $1,000 more, and eventually I ended up with $3 billion. There's no specific day in which I became rich, and the day before I was not. So we have a number of properties which seem to violate principle 3, the premise 3, the abstract principle that John Scott lays out in premise 3. So clearly premise 3 has to be false, just because it lead to all oak trees being acorns, and all babies being old, and all poor people being rich, because you'd say the claim that just because eventually they'll be old, or eventually they'll be rich, or eventually they'll be an oak tree, that means that they've been that all along. And clearly that's an absurd result. So premise 3 is false. I think that there might be a way in which he could try fixing it, but we'll put that off for now. Ultimately, what that means is, as stated, John Scott's argument fails. He's going to have to come up with a better replacement premise for premise 3, which doesn't fall to the same concern. He needs to, in some way, differentiate properties like being old and rich from the properties of being a person, and say that this principle does apply to how the property of being a person works, but it doesn't apply to the property of being old, or the property of being rich, or the property of being an oak tree. So now I want to look at a different sort of argument. Here's an argument against premise 1. Earlier we looked at an argument for premise 1, that fetuses are persons. And now I want to look at the contrary side, an argument against that premise. So this is Hartshorne's argument, and our first premise is all things that are persons can speak, reason, judge between right and wrong, and have personal relations. And the idea here is, and this is a very common idea, particularly for people who support abortion, pro-choice, is that the idea that personhood, or what gives you a right to life, or what counts as that, or what makes you count as a person, is the sort of traits which adult humans have. The idea is that there's something that differentiates adult humans from dogs and animals, and differentiates adult humans from babies, and that's where our right to life stems from. It's from that thing that adult humans have, and here he has a list of things. I don't think he's going to be really committed to this specific list. He's just sort of trying to list off a couple of the differences. Clearly, he could have a more sophisticated account of what he means by adult human. We could have debates about what makes somebody a person and which adult human traits is it. But here's this is a good enough list to serve as an example of the sort of thing he's looking for. Of course, his second premise is just going to point out that no fetuses have these characteristics. And so then he's going to conclude that no fetus is a person. That would undermine the earlier argument we looked at, because if no fetuses were a person, then that first premise would be false, and then the rest of the argument wouldn't go through. I think that the earlier argument we looked at, right, John Scott's argument, he could admit this. John Scott's not arguing that babies have the ability to speak, reason, judge between right and wrong, have personal relations, but John Scott's trying to say something like, well, the personhood that those sorts of character traits show is something that the baby eventually gets, but because it doesn't get it at a specific point, it must have had it all along. So, what about this argument? Is there a problem with Hartshorne's argument? I'll go ahead and let you take a moment to look at it. I think it's going to be a valid argument, but ask yourself if you find both these premises reasonable. And by reasonable, I don't mean you like them or you want to believe what he says. Ask yourself, does your evidence, looking at this critically, do you think that the first premise and the second premises are true? And if you can honestly say yes, then it seems like you're forced to accept the conclusion. So go ahead and pause and take a moment. Okay. Well, now that you've examined his argument, I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide, where I'm going to raise a problem for this argument as well. The counterexample I want to provide here is um, infants and the senile. It seems like his argument might succeed, but now we're worried because if rights stem from the fact that if your personhood, the thing that means that you have a right to life, stems from your ability to speak, reason, judge, have all these adult human characteristics, well, there's a lot of things that don't have those adult human characteristics. Animals don't, which is a number of people won't find problematic because they think that we can kill animals and treat them however we want. But it doesn't seem that infants, not only do fetuses not have these traits, but neither do infants or senile, right? So the question we would have to ask Hartshorne is if I get dementia or Alzheimer's, do I also stop being a person and lose my right to life so that someone could kill me for my money or because I'm not useful to have around anymore? There's also a worry here that this isn't really just an argument for abortion, it's also an argument for infanticide. Infanticide being killing babies, killing infants. Clearly they don't have these adult human traits either. Now I think again Hartshorne could try defending this argument and trying to fix it up just like John Scott's argument. In fact, I'll give you what I think his response could be. One response he could say is that infants and senile aren't fully human, that being a person comes in degrees, that infants are more human, are more closely human and have a more stronger right to their life than fetuses do, and that senile have less of a right to their life than fully mature humans. Some people are going to have this is going to be hard for them to swallow, right? They're going to say that personhood is something you either have or you don't. So Hartshorne is sort of pushing a response here that being a person is something you can have in degrees, and having a right to life is something you can have in degrees. And that can be very worrisome. It's not quite clear if that's going to succeed, but that's at least a response to our objection, right? I think the worst objection he has to face is the fact that the infants and the senile don't count as persons on this argument, so he needs some sort of response, and this is one way in which he can try responding. I think another thing he could say is that one thing I think he actually does say is that while grandpa, if he becomes senile and has dementia, might not be a person anymore and may not have a right to life, there's still going to be a sentimental attachment by all of his loved ones, and maybe a way in which we need to respect his life before, which means we can't mistreat him now. It's not that he has a right to life now, it's that it would be disrespectful to the life he lived and the sort of person he was if we don't let him, what's left of him, the sort of animal that's left over, live out the rest of his life or die in a respectful way or something along those lines, or mistreat him now. And I think a number of people are going to have to be worried about our Hartshorne's argument here. Well, one thing I want to point out here is that in giving both these arguments